take a minute while we're figuring out the technology. Just want to acknowledge the people that are present here in the tables, and I wanted to see if they want to stand up so you can see who's around. So we have back there the Psychedelic Society of San Francisco, Daniela Negrin, she's here. And we have Dave Nichols, and he has a bunch of materials there. We also have Nikki Sauer from the Botanical Dimensions. We have the Chacruna table, Emily back there. We have maps. Ali and Ismail, can you raise so people can see you? We have back there some materials from Bioneers, and Stephanie had to leave and could not be present with us today. And we also have Catherine from the WVC. Where are you? Well, there's some materials over there, and you can, I suggest you can pass there to visit. I also want to say that Dr. Brook from the Source Foundation came all the way to this event. They are giving some grants for students that want to study psychedelics. Dr. Brook, are you around? Yeah, she's back there, so maybe you want to check with her. And we also have my friend Gina Randall, Native American from Alaska. Gina, are you around? Can you stand up? We're trying to reach Alaska and other regions of the U.S. Yeah, there's much more people that are very important here, but I just wanted to give this, mention a few that I remember, and the other one is that I forgot to acknowledge Janice Phelps and the CPTR program, the Certificate in Psychedelic Therapies and Research that is held here in CIIS. They're training psychedelic therapists. They also made a donation for our event. Janice couldn't be here today, but she sends her warm regards. And we're just about in time to pass the word to Sara that came all the way from the East Coast with a generous donation from MAPS. Thanks, Rick Dobling. We lobbied for it in Horizons, and he did it.
Yeah, I'll put it there. Let's see. Yeah, I think this is fine. Can you all hear me in the back? Okay, great. Good afternoon, everyone. It is such an honor to be here with you all and to be sharing space with you all this afternoon. And as Bia said, my name is Sara Reed, and I'm a marriage and family therapist, and I practice primarily in Farmington, Connecticut. And my presentation for you today is titled Ego Dissolution, Racial Wounds, and the Female Body, A Journey Home. And in this presentation, I'll provide an overview of the MDMA-assisted psychotherapy research, and I'll also share the unique experience I had as a participant in an MDMA-assisted psychotherapy research trial where I took MDMA in a controlled therapeutic setting. And I've often had some reservations about sharing my psychedelic experience publicly, given this cultural climate, being a young Black woman, but I believe it is time that other voices become part of this discussion and discourse about using psychedelics as a potential entry point for healing, or as a way for us to reconnect to ourselves, or as I call, journey home. At this time in my life, it feels important for me to humanize the experiences of people in research, especially in presentations that I do. So, because I think that sometimes we can get too caught up in the abstract and in the theoretical without really knowing how that abstract translates into practice and what it means for people in their real experiences. So to start, I want to position myself formally in this presentation as the study coordinator and co-therapist for the MAPS MDMA clinical study of PTSD for the MP16 trial at UConn Health Center. And our site works to make sure that people of color are represented in the research and that they receive treatments that are culturally relevant and sensitive to their needs and histories. And informally, I position myself as a young woman from the countryside of Kentucky, the daughter of Gerald and Joyce Reed, granddaughter of James and Sara Reed, and Loman and Sarah Owen. For if it weren't for the wisdom, strength, and courage of these people, I would not be standing here in front of you today. I would also like to dedicate this presentation to those parts of ourselves that we've left behind, or the parts that we've disowned for whatever reason. May you find liberation in your truth in your return home. Now let's get started. So MDMA is under investigation as an adjunct drug to psychotherapy for post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD, an FDA-regulated clinical trial sponsored by MAPS, which I'm sure you all are familiar with on this side of the coast. My presentation is doing some kind of timing thing. So let me go back and see if I can pause. Okay. So when I talk about MDMA in this presentation, I'm referring to the 99.9% pure MDMA, not ecstasy or Molly. And the difference is substances sold on the street under these names, ecstasy or Molly, may contain MDMA, but also may contain other unknown or dangerous substances. And it's still going on. Maybe can I get some AV help? Because I did not put a timer on my presentation. Not sure where this is coming from. Just a second, please. So maybe right here. So manual. Oh, no. Okay, sorry about that. Let's try this again. So, let's see, where was I? So it's also important to note that the basic premise of this approach is that the therapeutic effect is not due simply to the physiological effects of the MDMA, but is also the result of an interaction between the effects of the drug, the therapeutic setting, and the mindsets of the participant and therapist. So I just want to hold space for that it's not just someone can take MDMA and get this kind of treatment, but it's really the synchronicity between these three parts that make this treatment what it is. To say a little bit more about the treatment is comprised of a screening period to determine eligibility and both drug and non-drug sessions spanning over roughly a 19 to 38-week treatment period. And study participants receive 3 sessions of either MDMA or placebo in conjunction with psychotherapy over a 12-week treatment period. So you have 3 prep sessions in the beginning, followed by an experimental session with integration sessions after that, then another experimental session, integration sessions, another experimental session, and integration sessions after that. And the primary outcome measure for the study is the CAPS-5, or the Clinician-Administered PTSD Scale. And to say a little bit about the treatment approach, participants are in a controlled clinical setting in a warm, supportive environment with 2 therapists, male and female dyads. And therapists have a stance of empathic presence and listening, so an attitude of openness and curiosity towards the participant's therapeutic process. And the therapeutic movement is coming from within the participant rather than the therapist. So there is non-directive communication, or what we call an interdirective experience for the participants. So emphasis is on invitation rather than direction. And lastly, we do use music, or just part of the treatment approach that I chose to punctuate here is that we use music to help support the participant's experience and invite periods of inner focus. To say a little bit more about the therapeutic approach. Biological and psychotherapeutic approaches are applied synergistically to facilitate trauma processing, thereby decreasing or eliminating chronic hyperarousal and stress reactions to triggers. MDMA can reduce the fear response and decrease defensiveness without blocking access to memories or preventing a deep and genuine experience of emotion. So, in other words, MDMA may help to catalyze the therapeutic process by allowing participants to stay emotionally engaged in their experience while revisiting traumatic experiences without becoming overwhelmed by the anxiety or other painful emotions. And as they're able to engage, stay engaged in their emotional experience, they are also able to restore sometimes be able to restore their experiences in a way that's more affirming. So to talk about some prior results, in MAPS completed phase 2 trials with 107 participants, 61% no longer qualified for PTSD after 3 sessions of MDMA-assisted psychotherapy 2 months following treatment. And at the 12-month follow-up, 68% no longer had PTSD. So, of course, that begs the question, at least for site personnel at our site, is this treatment relevant for people of color? How can this treatment be relevant for people of color? So, researchers are now, our site included, are gathering information to answer that question. But what I can say is that our racial demographics have improved since the phase 2 studies. So if you look at this chart here, this is the current MP16-17 racial demographics update. So if you take a look at the top, we have white, non-Hispanic, Latino, the percentage of, actually I'm going to read it from here because it's a little hard to see there. So the percentage of white participants in the study is 76.7%, and they make up 60.7% of the population, which translates to white folks are overrepresented in the study. Whereas if you look at white, Hispanic, Latino participants and Black or African American participants, these two groups are both underrepresented in the research. So this too begs the question of why are these two groups not represented well in the research? And of course, there is a terrible history of folks in clinical research using Black, brown, and yellow bodies to experiment with. Of course, there is a war on Black and brown people and poor people disguised as a war on drugs that likely has people of color not lining up at the door to be screened for the study. Of course, there's still stigma in communities of color about seeking help for mental health ailments. So there are a lot of barriers we have to overcome in making sure that folks are represented equitably in this research. And this is just a start that we've seen so far in the study. Now, to go back to this question, can this treatment be relevant for people of color? Again, we're still exploring the answer to that question. And to assist in that exploration, I would like to talk about my experience in the MDMA PTSD therapist training study. So I received MDMA in a one-time MDMA-assisted psychotherapy trial known as MT1 as part of the MAPS therapist training program. This was a week-long study where I received both MDMA and placebo. And some objectives of that study were to measure the psychological effects of MDMA in an MDMA-assisted psychotherapy session, also to expand the knowledge and skill of co-therapists conducting or wishing to conduct MDMA-assisted psychotherapy research. And although both of my sessions were very special and important and meaningful, I will only talk about my experience with MDMA today, and I will talk about it through storytelling. I feel like I'm dying, but it's okay, I say with a smile on my face, constantly checking the clock. I try to follow my ascend, that is, trying to figure out the moment when the ordinary becomes the non-ordinary. And I was able to at first, but then there was a moment where time sped up. I kept trying to track all the connections my brain was making, but I couldn't. Here it comes. There were no thoughts or feelings. I could just feel my brain doing something. Everything happening so fast, I couldn't keep up. So I had to choose to continue to be an observer in my experience or experience what's happening directly. I let go. Eyes closed. I let the drug and the music carry me away. And shortly after that, my deceased grandmother appears. Imparting her wisdom, not only for me, but for my mother, we shared a beautiful yet brief moment. Tears of love flowed down my face, and joy filled my heart. She carried me to a place I knew existed but never seen, a place that felt so familiar but so distant. I called that place home. I was a small part in this whole. I finally had a place where I belonged. And for the first time in my life, I felt free. Me, a young Black woman, free. I continue to climb higher energetically, spiritually, and start to notice the heaviness of my body, that my body was somehow slowing me down. And wearing two hats in this experience, not only as a participant, but a trained therapist who was curious about the onset effects of the drug, asked if there were any techniques I could do to help my body keep up. And little did I know that this body, with all of its blackness, femininity, joy, and pain, would be the bulk of my exploration in this session. Now, with my defenses dissolved, I am raw and open, flooded with emotions, flooded with the stories and the memories of my past and ancestral past, the racism, the sexism, the rapes, the silence. My body, my cells, remembering these stories, remembering the constant fight of what it takes to stay alive in this body. Oh, to be alive. As a Black woman, I've had to learn how to navigate this white American world in order to survive. I've learned the language, the mannerisms, the performance of whiteness. And I underestimated how much those learned behaviors impacted me. And some of you know that narrative. I've got to be twice as good to get ahead or get noticed, or not be too loud, or play nice, or don't wear this, or don't do that. Don't. Do you know what that narrative can do to the psyche? To say that you have to deny parts of yourself in order to be accepted, to not be harmed. And you know, those adaptive ego defenses that help me not react to every micro or macro aggression that came my way, those defenses that have been a necessary part of my development to withstand the isms of this life, those defenses that helped me survive in the only world I knew, no longer worked. So I was forced to reconnect with the stories in that 27-year-old body in a way that I had never done before. And that is to connect to a truth that even though my personal reality, I'm beyond being a young, Black, educated woman from the South, that my political reality doesn't allow me to have those same privileges of existing beyond those social markers and those narratives. So I had to learn how to hold space for both my personal reality and my political realities. And as I close, I'd like to briefly just talk about some clinical applications. So lessons that I learned is that Journeying home isn't about finding a place. It's about learning to love and be what the complexities are within you. That home is where the performance stops and play begins, and play where you can experience new possibilities. I also had some shifts in my clinical work post-study, so I incorporated the body a lot more in my traditional psychotherapy training, and that was very helpful for the women that I worked with, especially women who endured a lot of trauma. And insights for future research are some more of my curiosities about future research. So I'm very much interested in the somatic experiences of people of color. So some curiosities I have are, will other people of color experience a similar freedom that I experience, or expansion of their emotional experiences? Will people of color process differently with their bodies? Will there be trends of intergenerational traumas and histories of our ancestral past that will also come up for healing? So we hold all of those curiosities at the forefront of our minds and our work at our site. Even though our site is unfortunately closing down, we've been forced to reconfigure and are finding new ways to continue to make sure that people of color are still represented in this research and have access to this treatment. So I close my presentation today. So thank you all for being here, and I wish you a beautiful journey in your life.
We have the panelists come up to the stage. Yeah, sure. Yes, please. Oh, you can stand if you like that. Sure. Because when I get to the okay. Oh, no, she's going to come here to speak, though. Yeah. Yeah, the panelists will come here to speak. Yeah. Okay. Okay, great. Thank you. Hi, everyone. Thanks for your patience as we get ourselves organized. I'm Jae Sevelius. I'm a research psychologist and associate professor at the University of California, San Francisco in the Department of Medicine, and I'm really honored to be moderating our first panel. And this panel is entitled Women's Spirituality, Feminism in Psychedelic Studies, and Drug Reform Activism. Our first panelist is Dr. Annette Williams. She is chair and core faculty in the Women's Spirituality program at the California Institute of Integral Studies. She holds a doctorate in philosophy and religion with specialization in women's spirituality. Welcome, Dr. Williams.
Okay. Maybe I won't need my glasses. I always increase the font so I can read without the glasses. Little cheat. Okay. Oh, good afternoon, first of all. So in thinking about women, plants, and spirituality, I thought about the traditional West African Yoruba relationship to the plant realm as articulated in their traditional religious beliefs. I also thought about individual women of my acquaintance and their relationships and interactions with plant medicine, with the plant realm. The first portion of this paper is a sketch of the Yoruba traditional religious relationship to the plant realm and the activities of women in this regard. The second portion of this paper will speak on a more personal level of women's relationship to and interactions with plant medicine. The reason for my focus on the Yoruba is twofold. One, Their traditional religion is an area of personal interest and focus. Second, the Yoruba arrived in large numbers to the shores of the Western Atlantic relatively late in the era of the slave trade. As such, the retentions of their traditional beliefs and practices can be readily seen throughout the Caribbean and South America. Similar African retentions are evidenced in North America. The overview. The ontological orientation of the Yoruba is one of seamless interrelationship between the realms of the seen and unseen. All is imbued with Ashe, life force. Orun, heaven, and Aye, earth, are not cleaved. Rather, they are interpenetrating. Right relationship and balance between the seen and unseen realms is the measure of health. Within Yoruba religion, there are priestesses. These women are ritualists, divinatory seers, spirit mediums, and healers. In Yoruba Women, Work and Social Change, McIntosh states, since the goal of religious ceremonies was to restore balance and harmony between the various components of the physical and spiritual worlds, any rituals that did not include women would be pointless, end quote. Dis-ease and illness are taken as indication that restoration of this balance is needed. As in the words of Oyeronke Olajubu from her book, Women in the Yoruba Religious Sphere, among the Yoruba, sickness attests to the fact that an individual is out of tune with nature and the supernatural, end quote. Healing involves restoration of physical, psychological, and emotional well-being, and also involves balancing or recalibrating the relationship between the seen and unseen realms. Olajubu continues, medicine among the Yoruba encompasses the use of herbs and the act of combining herbs with incantation and/or sacrifice, end quote. It might have come as a surprise to British imperialists who, during the European witch trials, suppressed women's healing arts, but as conveyed by McIntosh, a report on Yoruba women's economic activities during the colonial period found that women were herbalists and traditional medical practitioners who were consulted about illness. The professional Yoruba woman, medicine woman, is called an Onishegun. Ewe is roughly translated as leaves and includes plants, herbs, roots, barks, etc. As prescriptive, it is plant medicine. As plant medicine, the dimension of spirit is paramount. Tariq Sawandi, writing on plant spirit medicine in Yoruba tradition, states that plants are living, breathing, communicating creatures, endowed with personality and attributes of soul. They are ready, willing, and able to cooperate with and assist humanity. Olajubu adds emphasis to this in stating that the Yoruba perceive herbs as possessing life, names, taboo, and praise names, or oriki. Hence, to approach, annex, or utilize them, a special kind of knowledge is required. This knowledge is the knowledge of working with the unseen realms. Olajubu continues that the invisible plane of power is within the custody of women, and it serves as the base on which the visible plane of power rests. She goes on to state that certain deities are perceived to be custodians of herbs for healing. The healer is expected to know and be on good terms with such deities. Two primary examples are Osayin, the deity of herbs and herbal potency, and Oshun, whose water itself is a potent healing force and whose inclusion is needed in remedies. Water to the Yoruba is a primordial element with supernatural qualities that regenerate and effect wellness. A healer's effectiveness is therefore contingent upon her relationship with the spirit realm. The healer is also a diviner. Diagnosis and prescriptive remedy are ascertained through the technology of divination. Erin Dilogun, or 16 Cowrie, is a system of divination attributed to Oshun, and it is said to offer direct access to herbs and roots. While other diviners have to pay homage to the Iya Ami, a group through offerings and sacrifice for the efficacy of herbs and roots used, Erin Dilogun practitioners do not. And the Iya Mi group, headed by Oshun, is a society of powerful women who straddle the realms. In African medicine, Tariq Sawadi reports additional channels of communication between the individual and plant spirits, as included trance states, dreams, and ingestion of the herb. Retentions. The authors of Women in Africa and the African Diaspora affirm that during slavery, black women performed healing roles and had to rely on a number of home remedies for survival. Some of this knowledge, particularly of the value of medicinal herbs, was derived from Africa. In North America, the slave codes prohibited any practice associated with African traditional religion, most famously drumming. Nevertheless, African retentions were evidence as seen in hoodoo and voodoo, hoodoo and conjure. In African American folk healing, Stephanie Mitchell maintains that hoodoo was pragmatic, revolving around roots and herbs for healing or protection, with a constant awareness of the interconnectedness of all life. The conjurer could also be known as a root worker, because knowledge and use of plant life is part of the practice of conjuring. And conjuring involves an intimate relationship with the realm of spirit. Cementing the close affinity of New World folk healing with African epistemologies, Mitchum states, folk healing depends on the ability of the healer to orchestrate the flow of the natural, spiritual, and relational aspects of life. The practitioner learns to work the elements in order to draw power to achieve some desired end. And this working the elements entails connecting to and communicating with their spiritual essence. Personal stories. Yoruba traditional religion and its derivatives are practiced in the United States and elsewhere. As discussed, the spiritual technology of working with plant energies is an integral part of this spiritual tradition. Working with a priestess of Olokun, the deity associated with the depths of the sea, I was taught the correct way, the respectful way, to cultivate and work with plants and leaves. Prayers are said and songs are sung to honor the spirit of the plants while working with them, and in turn, they share their healing essence. Following a traumatic incident, I received an herbal cleansing from a priestess of Oshun. Again, prayers were said and songs sung, along with other ritual components designed to elicit the benefits of the plant's healing spirit on my behalf. Tobacco and marijuana, along with ayahuasca, opium, and others, are classified as plants with psychoactive properties. My great-grandmother, Margaret Mackenzie, was a root woman living in Mandeville, Jamaica. During my eldest sister's childhood, she lived with great-grandmother Margaret. Being 18 years my senior, my sister had the opportunity to live in rural Jamaica, observing and experiencing firsthand great-grandmother's relationship with her community. Individuals came to great-grandmother for physical and spiritual healing, as well as for divination. My sister states that our great-grandmother used to read people, aided by the tobacco that she grew. My sister uses the term smoking people to describe our great-grandmother's practice because she would light rolled tobacco, sort of makeshift cigar, and proceed to blow smoke over the head and body of an individual while receiving divinatory visions and insight. A good friend, whom I will call Evelyn, was kind enough to share personal anecdotes for this presentation. She begins, I have had several profound experiences aided by the use of marijuana through both smoking and ingestion. In Jamaica, when I was about 20 years old, I took a trip to Jamaica with my friend S. While there, we went with a cousin of mine to meet a group of old Rastafarians in the mangrove swamps. I remember smoking ganja with them, and they had a large black book, and they explained the spiritual beliefs that underpinned their philosophy. At the time, I remember an unusual level of understanding and perception, even though I could not understand what they were saying. S later confirmed that they were speaking Amharic, but communicated with us telepathically. The experience felt at the time like a profound initiation, which I have never forgotten. Joshua Tree. During my mid-40s, I went with my husband at the time and his friend hiking through the desert to see the beautiful stark terrain and the ancient petroglyphs on the rocks. During that first walk, I was constantly stuck by cactus thorns of the cholla, the barrel cactus, and other forms of cactus plants. It seemed as if no matter how hard I tried to avoid being stuck by walking as far away as I could from the plants, I was stuck continuously. And I felt very uncomfortable at the end of the hike, in spite of having worn thick socks and boots. The next time we went hiking, we smoked marijuana first. I approached the largest cholla plant I could see, and with sincerity and humility addressed the plant directly. I said, "Grandmother, please teach me how to walk in the desert." I then saw the plant increase in size dramatically, with golden vibrational energy surrounding her. I felt honored and deeply grateful for her willingness to communicate with me, and I was never stuck by thorns in the desert again, though we went hiking in that area and different parts of the desert over many years. Her home. Recently, I was at home in bed, recovering from a long series of surgeries to remove a sarcoma, a cancer tumor on my left calf. During the final stage of recovery, while healing from a skin graft, a small mass appeared on the site of the original surgery, now covered with the skin graft. The doctor excised the mass and sent it to pathology. While waiting for the results, I was resting one afternoon in bed after having taken marijuana to relieve the pain in my leg and the residual pain on my thigh at the site of the skin graft. I asked the teacher within for a sign. In the living room, I saw my doctor's face and upper body in his blue surgical uniform. He was smiling at me. The image looked like a movie projection. Then I looked toward the left and saw the wall between the living room and the galley kitchen glowing with white light. I knew I was healed and that the cancer had not returned. It has not returned. Conclusion. To summarize and conclude, I have presented a snapshot, tiny snapshot, of the Yoruba ontological perspective that perceives everything as imbued with Ashe, life force, or spirit, and that comprehends the realms of the seen and unseen as interpenetrating. Balance and harmony are needed between the realms for health. Women as Onishegun are instrumental in healing and in the restoration of balance. Ewe, plants and herbs, are a fundamental prescriptive. Through divination and other means, the healer establishes communication with the spirit of the plant on behalf of the individual seeking healing. Retentions of this ontology and attendant spiritual technologies are found in African American folk healing traditions and in the folk healing traditions of other regions to which enslaved Africans were shipped during the Atlantic slave trade. As we look to and use psychoactive plants in contemporary healing, it is important to remember that the spirit of the plant, its Ashe, its efficacious essence, must be honored. I dare say that the misuse of some psychoactive plants and associated negative consequences stem from not honoring the power and spirit of the plant. Let us be mindful.
Viva Shun!
Thank you so much for that powerful talk. Next up, we have Val Corral. Valerie Leveroni Corral is the co-founder and the director of the Women's Alliance for Medical Marijuana, the longest-running medical marijuana collective in the U.S., founded in 1993 in Santa Cruz, California. Thank you so much for being here, Val. My pleasure.
Yeah, I like to move around.
Sure, I can take your favorite.
Oh, that'd be nice. Thanks. Let me come this side.
Good.
Great. Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm so delighted to be invited here and to be among my sisters and brothers and family. And this my esteemed colleagues who are scholars and academics, and I am not. I'm here because I fall in love, and because the medicines, this world of plants and natures and its connection, have invited me back to be part of something greater than myself. And it's taking a lifetime to do that. And to do that, it's a stumbling set of challenges and an exquisite dance. So I have 15 minutes to speak to you about what you already know. And that's really convenient because it's 15 minutes. And it is, it's something that we've been met with, especially as women, and in this very large movement of being human, the human movement. And in my case, in the cannabis and psychedelic movement, but focused on the cannabis movement and legalization, which I shudder to think, I have to agree that it has been nothing but challenge. And yet at the same time, it's keeping many people out of prisons. And it's a double-edged sword, as many things are when they're gifted to us and as we struggle. I remember talking about the revolution with John Trudell, and he said, Valerie, it's not a revolution. Trust me, there's so much to lose in a revolution. It means that you revolve back to where you were before, but this is the evolution. And we are partners in this. So, you know, power, finance, it lays in the hands of usually the wrong people. At least that's my opinion. And I think probably all of ours. What has happened with this legalization movement, with this peace that was born on the backs of people suffering, born on the backs of illness, and it was the medicalization of cannabis, and it has become a practice in economy. It's become medicalized and institutionalized now in a very different way. That is, what are the problems with that? Well, more people can access it, but people who really need it, many of the people who really need it, cannot access it because of its exorbitant cost. And there is a malady, a problem, an illness that arises when the people who need it most can't access it. In the state of California, there's no tax break for those who provide cannabis at no cost. And what is this better? Can you hear me better? Okay. For instance, in the last year, in 2017, WHAM gave away $265,000 worth of cannabis. That's significant, but there's no tax break for it. And that, what does that mean? It just means that now that it's legal, that cost an additional 36% on top of $265,000. So that's a great deal of fundraising to do. So I'll talk about what we're doing to try to deal with this ominous problem, because legalization didn't cure one person. It did not eliminate illness. It did not end suffering, but instead it's actually created more suffering for some people. We've taken WHAM and we're reforming it because we haven't been open since January 1st, and that's significant. So that means the work that we do, well, let me put it this way. WHAM cannot give away cannabis or work in the dispensing cannabis, but it's legal for an individual to give away up to 1 ounce at a time to somebody else. And it's not determined what that ounce would be, because many of the people with whom we work are indigent people who are extremely ill, and we always work with the most ill and most needy first. And you know, one doesn't really need to worry about the selfish or the greedy because they always take care of themselves. So that's handy too. And what we're doing now is we're splitting WHAM. As tomorrow, I will sign a lease, finally, on a building. We've got one. And we'll split that building. The smaller piece of it will be a dispensary. And that dispensary will help us to provide cannabis and other phytotherapeutic applications, because we know that no single thing heals. It's a journey for us to do this work. In 25 years, there are many things that I've learned, and I'm constantly learning from the people that we serve. But definitely, to think that I have an idea of how someone else's healing would be or should be is not so. I know what I might do, and even sometimes that's a mystery. Right? So we're splitting our building. A very small piece will be the dispensary, as I said, and the other piece will be a community center. It's WHAM Phytotherapies. And the reason we're doing this is because what we really want to do is to invite the healers, the people, the teachers from everywhere, from our community as well, into this place to practice and to provide information, to contextualize, and inform anyone who would like to come, anyone from our community, doesn't even have to be involved, of course, in cannabis, and to take this a database and a bank of knowledge and make it accessible to people, so that before, if they decide to go into the dispensary, they can access the data, a collected body of information, and find out what may be useful for them. So if you have anxiety, don't run to the tall tales of CBD, in my opinion. That's just hype. It's a good one because it doesn't get people high. Pharmaceutical companies aren't scared about getting sued because somebody gets too high on THC, can't handle it, whatever, jumps out, runs, has a panic attack. So that's the safe course of action, not to say that people don't feel altered by CBD, but I think it's hype. And I see in our practice that while CBD may be an effective tool, it is part of a tool, certainly not the answer for seizure disorders. We find that there are many other potential uses of cannabis. But if you have anxiety, you might just need 350 milligrams of magnesium because you probably don't take much or any, and it's very difficult to get. Some GABA. There are things that you can take instead of purchasing a $80 bottle of cannabis from a dispensary made from hemp. And you can try these other bits and pieces. So our thought is that by bringing in a plethora of information to people, kind of like a health club, you can join it. You can go 5 days a week or 7 days a week. You can work out for an hour, or you can just have your card and never go. Right? And then, but it feels like you're working out because you've spent your money doing it. What we have done is we're bringing in a physician who'll work with ketamine. And we're inviting other practitioners and healers and teachers, wisdom keepers. Many women are part of this, and we're hoping that in the event that this grows, like if you build it, they will come, and we are they, and we'll be there. And there are so many of us that really want to heal ourselves. And the idea is to build a worker-owned collective, cooperative. Can't say the word collective. And that, with that in mind, the reason is after doing this for 25 years, I realized that the greatest parts of ourself that we give are the parts that we know that we own. That they're our personal experiences. They're the ones that have opened us up and turned us on and helped break down those parts where we're stuck. And that's the piece that if we are invited to participate in, to take ownership in our own healing, ownership in our own lives, from if you're well, stay well, come and hang out with us. If you're sick, get well, come and hang out with us. And if you're dying, die well, and we'll come and hang out with you. And that's been our work for as long as we've been doing this publicly. It's been our work longer because we're all doing this our whole lives. We're all becoming masters, a little bit at a time. The best way to become a master is to not think about what other people need, what their desires are, that you master. There's a mastery of something other than self. And that's a really good job. It's one you can't fail. Anyway, thank you so much, and appreciate being here. And I wanted to just say something. One more thing. In 2017, in California, 250,000 Californians became medically bankrupt. In the United States, 642,000 people became medically bankrupt. We have a lot of work to do, and it's in our caring for one another, sharing what we have, as we look at we see the devastation and the loss, not only, yes, in our state because it's so present, but in the world that we live in. We have enough to share. You definitely, everybody in this room has something that they can give to someone else or to many people. And this is where we become freer. It's lighter. You don't have to carry as much around. And others will benefit. And they will give. My nonna used to say, life is a wheel. And you give in the moment that you have to give, and someone is in need. And don't worry about that person giving back to you, because when you're in need, someone will be there to help you. So thank you. Thanks for helping me, and much love.
Thank you so much, Val, for sharing so powerfully about your very compassionate work. Thank you. Next up, we have Wendy Chapkis. Wendy Chapkis is a professor of sociology and women and gender studies at the University of Southern Maine. She's an incredibly prolific writer, and she's going to be talking to us today about Trouble in Paradise, Lessons in Gender, Race, and Class Inequality in Marijuana Legalization. Welcome, Dr. Chapkis. Thank you for being here.
Yeah, probably. Yeah, you know, I'm not going to do the PowerPoint. You can all imagine the images I was going to show. We don't have to hide our other speakers. Thank you. Great, thank you. So, yeah, I can't really see because the mic is in the way, but I'll pull this out here. So first of all, thank you, Bia, for bringing us all together. This has just been already a wonderful day, and I'm looking forward to the rest of the presentations. By the way, the title Trouble in Paradise was created well before the horrific fires that are serving as such a heartbreaking backdrop to this. Like all of you, I'm grieving for Paradise, California. This talk is about the illusion that if we could legalize what were illicit drugs, we would somehow be living in paradise. And I have been studying the medical marijuana legalization and now recreational marijuana legalization movement for 25 or 30 years. And I thought at this critical moment where it looks like already the majority of Americans live in places where there is some access, at least, to legal marijuana, and we're moving increasingly toward legal access to psychedelic drugs, that it might be helpful to think about some of the lessons that we've learned from cannabis legalization that we either might want to import into psychedelic drug legalization or avoid. So the first lesson is that psychoactive botanicals represent a really special problem in terms of drug legalization. This is definitely going to be true for psychedelic drugs in much the same way that it was for medical marijuana. I just saw an extraordinary documentary last week called From Shock to Awe, which if you haven't seen it, you should. It's wonderful. It's about 3 veterans suffering from really intense PTSD, 2 of whom make use of ayahuasca to, in a ritual setting to treat their PTSD, and the 3rd uses MDMA in a more conventional setting of a therapist's office. And both substances had really profound effects on the patients. And while there was something compelling about the footage of all 3 of the veterans, the images of these vets sitting around a campfire doing ayahuasca together and then having really profound revelations about the experience of war very much moved me. And I walked out of the theater thinking, yep, MDMA is going to be legalized. Ayahuasca we'll have to see. I hope I'm wrong, because I think the ayahuasca experience was absolutely transformative for these people. But having spent, as I said, 2 or 3 decades looking at the long battle to get cannabis recognized as a medicine, I think I can safely say that ayahuasca, like peyote and mushrooms, are going to have very different challenges to establishing legitimacy as a medicine than MDMA or even LSD. And this is because botanicals are, in general, not defined as real or legitimate medicine in our culture. And this has almost nothing to do with the pharmacological differences between plants and synthetic drugs, much more to do with the professionalization of medicine in the United States. As you may know, in the 19th century, self-defined regular doctors, that's what they called themselves, who were exclusively men, distinguished themselves from what were known as root and herb practitioners, most of whom were women, through the use of often toxic and certainly more dangerous medicines. The sidelining of what became known as crude botanicals in favor of single compound synthetic pharmaceuticals has reverberated throughout contemporary debates over the medical use of marijuana. In the time that I was particularly studying this and writing the book Dying to Get High, which is mostly about Valerie's organization, WHAM, I listened to the then U.S. Deputy Drug Czar Andrea Barthwell telling Congress that cannabis shouldn't be considered a real medicine because, quote, it's not just a single drug. It contains more than 400 chemicals. And furthermore, she said, its delivery system is, quote, primitive. There is nothing that tells us from science now that a smoked, crude botanical should be a medication. As I discussed in the book Dying to Get High, in order to understand why some drugs, but not all, get labeled medicine, and while some healers, but not others, are regular doctors, it's important to ask who benefits beyond the patient from such distinctions. And in a culture of profit like we live in, and pharmaceutical control like we have, benefit is most often defined in narrowly monetary and proprietary terms. Now, the medical marijuana movement itself has been divided over whether the path to profit is the best way to go. And as you know, in the United States, the primary way that patients have been able to access marijuana has been through dispensaries. Some of these dispensaries are small, but many of them are extremely large. For instance, the Harborside Dispensary in Oakland that has an annual revenue of about $25 million and has more than 200,000 members. Now, as these numbers suggest, the dispensary system has been very efficient in serving large numbers of patients, but the nonprofit provision has significant limitations, and Valerie was just talking about them. The most significant limitation is that poor people cannot access their medicines. Even with the preservation of the Affordable Care Act, millions of Americans have no access to health insurance, and even those who do have access to health insurance generally cannot get botanical drugs covered by that. So the second lesson from the marijuana legalization movement is we should leave no one behind, both in terms of cost and in terms of access to psychedelic medicines. I think we need to be asking ourselves whether the corporate equivalent of dispensaries, that is pharmacies and the pharmaceutical industry, should be the primary portal through which individuals are legally able to access psychoactive substances, especially botanicals. And here's another warning from the marijuana legalization movement. Attempts to circumvent the pharmaceutical industry will be met with a very hostile response. Big Pharma has long seen access to botanical cannabis as a threat to their bottom line, and they've responded in ways intended to shore up corporate control over medicine. And I have a whole bunch on this, but I think in the interest of moving along, I will just say that they have pumped enormous resources into trying to defeat marijuana legalization. And most recently in Arizona in 2012 or 2014, there was a measure on the ballot to legalize, and the primary donor to defeat legalization was a pharmaceutical company called Insys Therapeutics. It became clear after that measure was defeated and Insys Therapeutics got approval for a synthetic cannabinoid drug called Syndros, why they were so eager to defeat the cannabis legalization measure. Americans are clearly really eager for more natural medicines. Already more than a third of us make use of so-called complementary and alternative medicine, and the biggest form of complementary and alternative medicine is botanical medicine. So Big Pharma is rapidly trying to create synthetic versions of promising botanical compounds, and as I said, in the case of cannabis, even directly funding opposition to legalization. So we really need to keep in mind when we think about psychedelic drug legalization, who's going to benefit and who's going to control access. And I think those questions can only be ethically answered if we keep putting front and center the people who are most harmed by the system that we have in place now. One form of harm is the harms caused by racism in this country. And we all know, and several people have already mentioned, the fact that people of color have been disproportionately impacted by the war on drugs. I know Bia said we weren't going to talk about it, but I have to at least say that African Americans are incarcerated at rates 5 times that of European Americans for drug offenses, despite the fact that white Americans and black Americans use drugs at the same rates. And what's even more, or no, not more, what is at least as disturbing to me is that in the aftermath of legalization, that we have reproduced rather than challenged those racial inequalities. For example, in Colorado, in the first 2 years after legalization in that state, arrest rates for marijuana possession among Latino teenagers rose more than 20%, and for black teenagers it rose more than 50%, while arrests for white teenagers fell by 10%. And this is, again, with similar patterns of use. And not only are racial minorities being excluded from the green rush and swept into the criminal justice system, but we're not doing enough as a community, as a movement, to address that. Another form of social inequality that is too often reproduced rather than challenged in our drug reform movements is gender inequality. And I want to end with, both because this is largely about gender inequality and because I'm a woman, but also because my research until quite recently has all been about gender and sexuality. For instance, before I wrote Dying to Get High, my book before that was about commercial sex and prostitution policies in Europe and the United States. And I initially thought, oh my God, what a stretch. I'm moving from sex to drugs. It's going to be completely different. But in fact, of course, both sex and drugs are largely considered vice crimes. And it turned out that the ideology behind policing both sex and drugs was very similar. These are dangerous practices made more dangerous by our policies rather than less dangerous. Quite intentionally, I think. I think this is not a side effect, but the actual intended effect of the kinds of policies we have around sex and drugs. But I also learned that problems of sexuality and gender are deeply embedded in both drug culture and drug policy reform. The culture shock that I experienced when I moved from gender and sexuality studies conferences that were populated mostly by women of all colors and queers of all genders to drug policy reform gatherings was astonishing. I mean, here was a sea of men, and they were all white, and they were almost all heterosexual. And I discovered very quickly that most major drug policy reform organizations were headed by white men. You know, the Ethan Nadelman Drug Policy Alliance, Rick Doblin Multidisciplinary Association of Psychedelic Studies, Alan St. Pierre of NORML, Rob Campy of Marijuana Policy Project. Fortunately, that is starting to change, but that was the world that I entered when I was doing this research. And I discovered that the marijuana world was this guys' club. And it was shocking to me because, as I said, my research was on Val Corral's organization and medical marijuana. Not surprisingly, medical marijuana was highly feminized. Debbie Goldsberry of Berkeley Patients Group, Valerie Corral of WHAM, Steph Shear of Americans for Safe Access. It was women who were doing the caretaking and the underfunded work of providing medicine to people who were sick and poor. And I was still shocked, though, that marijuana legalization for recreational use was all in the hands of men. I shouldn't have been. Pleasure and profit are considered sort of rightly the province of men, or sick and dying and wiping butts, as Val does. That's women's work. Far too often, this translated to me being the only woman on the panels that I was asked to speak at. And I see that being reproduced too often in the psychedelic drug reform movement. Just a few months ago, I was the only woman on a psychedelic science conference in Boston. And I was astonished that this is 2018, and I'm the only woman up here, and the entire panel was white. We have to do better than this. We can and we must do better than this, because if we don't, the legalization of these important substances will remain limited to those who can afford them or those who can risk arrest to access them. The massive profits that they will generate will be concentrated in the hands of the pharmaceutical industry and the corporate industry. In other words, without conscious effort, we risk reproducing the racism and the sexism and the ethnocentrism and the colonialism of so-called mainstream culture within the psychedelic community and within our vision for what an end to prohibition might look like. And that would be such a loss, because in my mind, psychedelics are all about revolutionary transformation. And I'm heartened today to be surrounded by so many who share that vision. Thank you.
Revolutionary transformation. Thank you so much, Dr. Chapkis. That was very inspiring. I feel revved up and ready to hear from our next presenter, who she's going to be using PowerPoint, so we're going to take a moment to get the technology set up. Dr. Michelle Corbin currently serves as Associate Professor of Sociology and Affiliate Faculty of Women's Studies at Worcester State University. And Dr. Chapkis will be, Dr. Corbin will be speaking to us about The Personal is Political, the Feminist Possibilities of Psychedelic Praxis. Thank you so much. Welcome, Dr. Corbin.
Wonderful. Thank you. It's wonderful to be here in this space and to have been invited to participate in the conversation today on women and psychedelics. So I am a feminist sociologist grounded in both sociology and women's studies. And that's in some ways the hat that I bring to this conversation. For myself, I have been at the intersection of psychedelics and feminism since graduate school. I wrote my dissertation on psychedelic drugs. Well, I didn't write it on psychedelic drugs because that would be very challenging. But my topic was the politics of knowledge of psychedelic drugs. And what my experience was is I ended up discovering these particular pathways, which I found personally liberating, was engaged in conversations with other people committed to revolutionary transformation, and saw very clearly how much it had to offer. But then I was also in women's studies classes and engaged in feminist scholarship, where I received very different lessons in what is liberation and what a revolutionary transformative path looks like. And as someone who walks back and forth, toggles back and forth between those pathways, part of what my work is always to see how those conversations can cross-pollinate one another. Since I'm here at a clinical location in a room full of people who perhaps have some appreciation of the psychedelic side of the path, I thought that today in my talk I would focus more on the women's studies and the feminist history and the lessons that we can bring into our work from feminist history. So as I was preparing for this talk, I was thinking women and psychedelics, and I began to just look at the research. Where are we lately? And what I was struck by is the predominance of PTSD, the predominance of trauma, the focus within psychedelics communities of the power of these substances to address trauma. And then in particular, because for women, and women actually have higher rates of PTSD in this country than do men. And so it's been war veterans and sexual assault survivors. And I thought, see, this is a gendered issue. Trauma is a gendered issue. Trauma is a political issue. And so I was really struck by how this has become one of the hearts of our conversations. But of course, because the predominant disciplines have been psychological, then the individual frame of analysis, the clinical, right, the less overtly politicized women's studies aspects are what leads the conversation. Now, as a feminist, if we think about the phrase, the personal is political. Women have higher rates than men. If we look at this issue of sexual violence and the personal experiences of women, especially at this moment, it is clear that the personal is political, as they said in the 1970s women's movement. So at this moment right now, for us to be engaged in a conversation centered in trauma and centered in the experiences of women with trauma is a political issue. So even though we enter through the micro level, even though we enter through the framework of the clinical and the therapeutic, it is always already a political issue and one of the most urgent political issues of the current moment. And so what I wanted to do was look at, well, this is not the first time a community of revolutionary and transformative women have taken up these questions. And so what I wanted to learn is, what can we learn from previous feminist responses to sexual and gendered violence? Again, this phrase, the personal is political. And just looking briefly at this history, because sexual violence has been at the root of women's struggles with power, whether black women under slavery or white women for birth control, or women having to bear too many children in poverty, or being sexually assaulted by their bosses because they occupy low positions of power. This has been at the root of feminist struggle from the very beginning. And so what have we learned? How did women respond? And I'm just going to touch on a couple points. And in some ways, I wanted to use the PowerPoint because in the age of Instagram, I can just give you some memes and some images, and hopefully you'll know what I'm saying. And so if we look in the history of the feminist response to sexual violence, what we see is the politics of care right from the beginning. Women reaching out to each other. I am my sister's keeper in the household, in the church, in the community, in the neighborhood. So the politics of care, as we see in psychedelic communities. But it was also an effort at institution building and collective care. Again, as has been mentioned, this collectivity, this horizontalism, this mycelium that has often been the experiences of women. And so the early women's movements built institutions of care. These are two examples of the first rape crisis centers, which opened in 1972, the one on the left in D.C. Interesting that we didn't even have, prior to 1972, any institutions that would intervene in women's experiences of violence. So one lesson is that the individual leads to the collective, that the individual becomes a radicalizing experience that has women come together to build institutions to deal with those traumas. The early movements also connected that individual experience to one of what was called consciousness raising, which then turned into movement building. So individual victims, in telling each other their stories, in seeing other women be victimized repeatedly and trying to drag them out of that situation, we saw the emergence of second wave feminist movements, one of the classic examples being the Take Back the Night movement, where women came together to say, I will not stay at home alone and afraid, we will take back these streets. Collective uprising built out of the individual experiences of trauma. We see iterations of this today in this moment. This issue of trauma couldn't be more relevant, whether that's the Me Too movement, which resulted again in individual experiences of women saying Me Too, beginning to raise this issue politically to the national stage. The issue of Time's Up, where celebrity women used their own voices to raise the issue that this was a systemic and a cultural problem. Or the example of Indigenous women, hashtag murdered and missing Indigenous women, or the hashtag Say Her Name, moving out of the Black Lives Matter movement, where women of color also using their individual experiences of trauma as mothers, as community members, as daughters and sisters who have been disappeared in this country, to shine a light and to build a movement to deal with the traumas. It also, though, had to go beyond movements. It wasn't just movements. It wasn't just protest in the street, but it had to involve the issue of changing leadership, changing laws, and changing policies. When the institutions are male-dominated, where men and white people hold positions of power, you cannot rely on just the benevolence of male leadership. You must change the structures of power. And this, I think, is an important lesson for us as we deal with the traumas that are ever widening in our society. So right now we saw a recent example of the feminist lesson of beginning to bring women into positions of leadership. And also the issue that they want to change laws and policies. So we have feminist lawyers who were part of these struggles, with Gloria Allred, a new documentary, or Kimberly Crenshaw, just to choose two key examples. And of course the Office of Violence Against Women, Title IX, right? We have to also build these into policy solutions. And of course, when you bring women into institutions of power, they have shown profound, courageous leadership in demanding that those systems be held accountable. The political is also personal. And so as we think about these lessons, the one I wanted to really focus on for today is that in the most recent movements around dealing with sexual violence is to reframe rape as a men's issue. And this has been brought up a couple times. In some ways, I don't think of this as a women and psychedelics panel. I think of this as a gender and psychedelics panel. And so part of the work has been to reframe rape as a men's issue and not as a women's issue. That involves, as we have seen lately, and I love this, top 10 tits and rape, where instead of telling women how not to get raped, you tell men how to not become rapists, right? Stop telling me how to dress. Why don't you tell men not to rape? This has been, I think, one of the leading edges of the feminist movement right now. And we see this also in efforts to hold individual perpetrators accountable. And so what I want to really in some ways focus on in my talk today is what can we learn from this feminist history as we enter the gateway of politics through our work with transforming trauma. So the last one here, not just holding individual men accountable, but noticing that it's about rape culture and toxic masculinities and not just individual perpetrators. And I think for us, the one I want to focus on, this one's the most relevant. And so what I did is I was just looking at the examples of the ways that feminist communities and the psychedelic communities are taking up these questions of trauma, largely driven through our clinical work. And what we see in ayahuasca, for example, is women beginning to do the organizing work to build guidelines and policies and pushback, being politicized through their experiences. And this is the one I'll end on. There's this discussion that I see, this sort of discourse, this sort of meme emerging around ayahuasca communities that the grandmother, right, it's this feminization of power, an icon of feminist power, has left the jungle to save the white man of his soul sickness before he fucks around and kills us all. I hope there's some truth to it. But my question is, what would it mean for this to be the medicine to cure the toxic masculinity, the white supremacy, and the violence in our culture? Where is the evidence that these medicines can lead to that kind of cure, la cura, for toxic masculinity? And unfortunately, what we see is an ongoing epidemic of sexual violence across our communities, whether that's the controversies at Burning Man or the controversies within ayahuasca communities. And so my concern is, yes, these are potent substances. I am struck by how they can dig out fear, and nightmares, and shaking, and liberate women and people of color from all manner of oppressions. Well, then can they dig out the rage, and the misogyny, and the entitlement that is driving epidemics of violence? And unfortunately, the medicine by itself does not seem to do that work, and we know that from feminist history. We have to start to cultivate that work. We have to be as dedicated in our psychotherapeutic protocols. We actually have to come up with social justice protocols to ask how we can ensure that this medicine is an antidote to the toxicity. I'm struck by that toxic masculinity. If this is going to be an antidote, it requires deliberate work. And I also want to say that we have to be cautious about framing our work around only, again, the curing of individual predators who are in our communities. Predators that apparently have drank ayahuasca for years and still have not been cured of being a predator. I am struck by that. And so the issue is not just to say we should focus on the psychological needs of predators, because as we see in this country, the psychologizing of white male violence, the depoliticizing of white male violence, oh, he was unwell, oh, he was bullied, oh, he had PTSD. Nah, I have PTSD. I've been bullied. You want to talk about people who are bullied? Let's talk about people of color and women, and we ain't out there shooting everybody. So let's make sure that we don't re-psychologize while we ask this question of in what ways could this be a cure for toxic masculinity and white supremacy? And so I guess my engagement with this issue of men's roles is in line with the feminist call to reframe these problems as a men's issue. I admire the leadership that Chacruna is bringing in terms of creating forums for women. They just released a set of guidelines for how women can stay safe. Later in the presentation, I wanted to shout out the Women's Visionary Congress and the Women's Visionary Caucus, Council, for lifting up the voices of women. They also have put forward sexual assault policies. You have the Bureau of Erotic Discourse at Burning Man. Women have been doing this work. But my question is, what are the brothers doing? How are we going to bring men in our communities into this conversation? Men of equality respect women's equality, right? It's not just about getting individual perpetrators to stop raping. It is about building a culture, about challenging rape culture, about putting women and people of color in positions of leadership, about not replicating systems that allow men who are going to be predators to be able to act with impunity and without accountability and blend into a culture that is largely replicating dominant values, which is what makes the rape comprehensible and possible in the first place. And so if this is going to be an antidote to toxic masculinity, it should not only be at the individual level, but it has to help men get woke, as they say in the movements, and as the t-shirt says, to stay woke. And so one last thing about this, because I know that I'm out of time, as I was looking again at some of these memes around ayahuasca, and this issue that ayahuasca is here to save the West from itself and to save the world from itself. I was talking to another panelist about when we bring these issues up, when we put out the guidelines, when we say that we're going to have consent politics at our festival and we're called feminist buzzkills. And we don't, right, we're trying to like harsh your mellow, and the trolls start to come for you, and everybody especially white men, start to get real defensive. And that's why I included this. I love the double entendre of the trigger. Pay close attention to whatever triggers reactions from you. Your triggers reveal the spot where an ancient pain is still buried. And so when I see all of these white men, especially white men in power, get all reactive when we bring up the politics of gender and violence, and what we know as practitioners is the grandmother will show you what your work needs to be. And so if you are all in your feelings, feeling some kind of way, because women in this community want to raise up these questions of inequality and sexual violence, maybe that trigger is telling you where some ancient pain is buried. You know, the pain of white supremacist capitalist patriarchy, that any revolution worthy of the word transformation has to deliberately dig out of our hearts and our cultures. Thank you.
Okay, we're going to ask the panelists to return to the stage, including Sara and Dr. Williams. Thank you. Kat, yes. Sorry about that. Trying to keep track of all these amazing women who have inspired us today. And at Bia's request, the way this is going to work is that we are going to take questions from the audience, but we're going to take like 4 or 5 at a time, and then we'll ask the panelists to respond to whatever question they feel inspired to speak to. And do we have a roaming mic? So who's going to get us started with a question? Questions? Oh, okay. So we're lining up on this side. Oh, okay. Okay, we have a question right here. Okay. Yes, we have cameras that are capturing the live stream, so if you feel comfortable coming to the front to ask your question, that would be great. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Gisele, and my question is actually, so thank you everybody for being here. It's been wonderful, and it was hard, Kathleen, when you were speaking about the 60s, and I didn't hear you mention the civil rights movement. So my question to you is that, where do you see the feminist movement and the psychedelics movement in conjunction with the structures in society, and especially with the inequalities, the racism, the African American population in this country. So I just wanted to name that and wanted to give you an opportunity to speak to that. Thank you.
We're gonna collect a few questions first. Thank you.
Many questions.
My name is Camille Barton. I'm from the UK. I do sort of diversity and intersectionality work within psychedelic research and drug policy. I thank you all for your presentations. It's really inspiring to hear you speak. I feel something I've noticed is there's been talk about intersectionality, but I haven't heard that much conversation around the role of white women in white supremacy culture, which there are more and more books and research coming out now. But I think sometimes the spectre of Donald Trump means that we focus a lot on him as a kind of scapegoat and also on particularly white men. But there is a long history, an ongoing history of white women contributing to white supremacy culture. So what are some of the practical tools or ways that we can reflect on that and how that relates to kind of us as groups of women in general? Thank you.
Hi, my name is Julia. I just wanted to thank everyone for being here tonight. So great to gather with other people to talk about these important issues. And I'm wondering if anyone up here has advice about how to do this. You know, like I live an hour and a half from here. I'm not necessarily, there aren't as many scholars in my area. So how do I bring together small communities in my kitchen or at the beach, or what tools would you recommend for that? Thank you.
We'll take two more.
Hi, Jody Evans. Just curious, in all of your work, what are some of the practices that you've seen that are essential to the power of the work or not?
Right, last question.
Hello, thank you for being here. You are all so strong and inspiring. My question is this: as a white woman, how do I help people of color get access to this healing and revolutionary medicine?
You have microphones on the. Bring one. Anyone who wants to respond first.
And can more than one of us answer each question? So we're starting with the first one. Oh, okay. Okay, thanks. Well, thank you for pointing out that in mentioning powerful social movements of the early 1960s, I did not mention the Civil Rights Movement, which I actually talked, I live up in the smoke up north, and so coming down today, driving an hour and a half, I actually talked the whole time so that I would clear my throat over and over so I wouldn't be doing it in front of you. And in my talk, I talked about that, my talk in the car to myself. I talked about that. And so I'm sorry I didn't say it out loud in this company. But I grew up in a rural, marginalized California lifestyle as a child, and I remember all at once, basically, in the very early 60s, becoming aware we didn't even have a television for a long time, so some movements as a young girl didn't get to me, but I remember becoming aware almost at once of course, the terrible racial, the schools and all the situations in the South that were making the news in that time, but the movement of people gathering and marching and white people coming from the North to join black people in the places where these conflicts were going on and standing up to it and building a political movement. It's true. I remember that being the first time that I was aware of, people do that. People can gather and protest and form resistance, informed resistance that is compassionate and that is brave and stubborn and effective in that it gets everyone thinking differently, whether it's from fear or from excitement, from signing on for that. And yet it also, in my experience, that activism really arose in the early awareness that this is a war we were in Vietnam, that this wasn't a military action on the side that we weren't supposed to notice, that this is actually a war. So they both rose. For me, they both rose similarly, even though the civil rights movement definitely started earlier. And then by the time the psychedelics got involved, it seemed to me that young people were were aware of many causes, but choosing the cause they were really going to show up for. And if that wasn't directly in my path, then how do I lend my support to that? You know, voting to some extent, but we had corruption issues then, and we didn't have an opportunity to vote on that so much. So I'm looking at myself now, wondering like the order of awareness and the order of engagement with these issues, and how much did it make my heart ache and feel like my responsibility to stand up for that issue. And so one of the things that I did as in the struggles was I moved to Oakland from, you know, the bubble of UC Santa Cruz to Oakland in that period in the late 60s, and just got to know people and have it become real for me, and take psychedelics with people of color and discuss and dance and make food together and all of those things. You know, I think we were trying, some of us who were not in the actual marches and the activism and the conflict, we were trying to find out how to live together. It's not a complete answer. It's what seemed to be healing for the people that I knew and informative and educational for me. And we managed to weave it together with the psychedelics. But, you know, I moved into being a deadhead for years, and there weren't many people of color in the dead scene, and it's a wonderful, wonderful movement, but those divisions have continued, or they did continue through that time, and I'm still learning. Thank you very much.
We're going to switch to this mic for the purposes of the live streams.
The question I want to speak to is access to these medicines for people of color. I think it's less a matter of access, or access is one part of it, but it's also the perception of people in the Black community that a lot of these medicines are white. You know, they're things that white people do. They're not, we will smoke our pot, you know, and that's about it, really. Maybe hashish from time to time. But it's still the same, it's still pot, it's still in the same family. So in terms of, there's a lot of that barrier has to be broken down. It's like the barrier around psychotherapy. So even put this in the class of medicine and medication, and it's, I think, be very difficult bridge to cross or to join the two groups. And I don't know, I'm a curious sort, and I'll try almost anything once. And I have had a ayahuasca experience in psilocybin, but I think it's more out of curiosity. I don't have the attraction to keep going back to it like week after week. I know some people who've used it, they use it like week after week, and I just can't, for me, maybe I don't know if it's a Black thing, but I just like, each experience is so rich. Why do you go back to it week after week? It takes so much time to unpack the one experience. I'm like, so there's a lot I think that goes into that. But I think a lot of it is the perception that these psychotropic entheogens and such are really something that's not a part of the Black community.
So when I'm the co-founder of WHAM. I began WHAM in 1993 with my then husband Mike, and I wanted to over the 25 years and over the decades, I thought that there would be little WHAMs springing up everywhere, that people in every community would band together because it's the safest, really the safest way to be, right? That's why we're a movement. We find each other and what's simpatico between us, or what's similar, and what's similar. And yet that wasn't really the case. I mean, we could, it's a shame what's happened in California, because we had 25 years to do it right. And greed won. But it didn't completely win, because in the back rooms and in private dealings and the underground, it's drugs, all drugs thrive. But not only the drugs, the politic, the communication around those substances thrives. And it's really where things get done. It gets done when we are all doing it together. So there is access to drugs. Can I tell you where to go to get it? Later. No. So, and, you know, to be open to the use. You know, I have to agree with you, Kat, that heroic doses change you. And I think that maybe microdosing is because is it harder to get? Like, no. Right? I mean, no, that microdose, I love microdosing. I think it's an excellent form, but it makes me think it's harder to get. So, and I want to address something really that's difficult to address. I want to address, and I wasn't, you know, I'm struggling with how to approach it, but white supremacy as women and our role in white supremacy. So I'm going to tell a story. When I was 5 years old, my best friend, her and my mom would go to work together, and they'd take us and drop us at kindergarten in San Rafael. And so we, as you could walk when we were 5 years old, you hold hands and you walk, and there's a crossing guard and across the street, and we'd stop at Vern's Market. And we stopped at Vern's Market once, and there's a candy, and it's 1957, and there's a candy, and we're looking at all the candies, and there was a candy called Babies. And I reached, it's licorice, so it was licorice, and I reached for it, and my friend takes my hand and she pushes it down, and she said, "You can't have that, that's a bad word." And I thought that it was a swear word because I didn't know what was. And it comes out to be that it's worse than a swear word, that it's that it could exist in 1957 in a candy in San Rafael in Marin County and anywhere on the planet, which became shocking. But it was so instilled in our society. The next day, on the way to school, it came up in the car, and it was, and I remember this because of the dead silence. And I say dead silence because everyone was uncomfortable. Our moms and us, we became uncomfortable. She didn't know what it meant, and I didn't know what it meant, but we came to uncover the personal experiences of racism as we grew up through school. How do we contribute as a culture? Well, I think in the personal is our invitation to people different from ourselves, and how we sit in equanimity with that. We have to arrive at an understanding of our own limitations as human beings, and our own racisms and our own sexism and our own shortcomings, our frailties. And when I'm in the position of that discomfort, it seems to be that I see more of my own limitations and frailties, which actually in the last couple of years have been massive. It's been huge. To look at the ways that I am, where I'm weak, and don't look at my humanness, the way that I fight like a dog to hold on to what I think, and not recognize how it hurts others. So I don't know what the role is fully of women in white supremacy, but I know that we've taken that role. I know that we reached for the candy. I know that it existed. I know that my mom didn't go down to the store and say, "Take it off the shelf." And I didn't either when I came to learn about it. It was a delicate subject. It took weeks of approaching that subject and discomfort for her and I because we really did not know how to talk about it. And I remember at dinner my parents talking about it and saying, don't you ever say that word. But I wasn't supposed to say shit or asshole either. So there's so much more context to that. And I still hold it. I still hold that space. But taking responsibility, your own personal responsibility, and calling out everybody is really, I think, the beginning of the next step that we can take. I wish I had a way to pull that thread, that if everybody pulled on it, it would unravel. And yeah, maybe we just need to all trip together.
So I'm just going to address two of the questions because they're all huge, but sort of what is white women's role in creating access and what are some of the practices that are essential? I think the first thing is refusing to speak on all white panels. It's just something I won't do anymore. And I think men should stop refusing to speak, or start refusing to speak on all male panels. I think we need to be collecting names of people who we can recommend and put them forward. I think we need to create diverse communities of practice. When Val says we should all trip together, I have to think about, I was invited recently to go to Peru and do ayahuasca with women, and it was going to be a feminine spiritual experience, and I thought, I don't know. I don't want to. Am I feminine? And do I want to be? Who are these women? And are they women who would I share the category uncomfortably? Am I going to be? So I think if we really want to encourage people, if we want people who think, I don't know, that's not my drug, I think really people have to be in communities that look like them, that feel like them. So that access is easier. It opens up space. I think we need to really listen to stories. Like, we're always happy to share our own, but finding ways to just shut up and listen, especially to stories that make us uncomfortable, to the ones that you think, they're talking about me, they're criticizing me, to listen really carefully to those. And I think I'll just end with this, and I think those of us with disproportionate structural power should take disproportionate risks. It's something I've learned in the academy. I'm a tenured professor, so I think I'm the first one on the line. Something is going to have to happen. I'm going to be the person that has to say it because I have some power. So I think those are my suggestions.
I also wanted to speak to the issue of white women, and in a couple ways, agreeing with what Wendy was saying, especially about handing the mic, supporting the leadership of women of color, listening to people of color, educating yourself. I mean, I think those are all things those of us with white privilege have to do. Another layer I would add is I think we need to start troubling this narrative. Like, can you believe 53% of white women voted for Donald Trump? Yeah, because if you look at the history of white supremacy, and there's a lot of research coming out about this right now, women have played an integral role, just like in the civil rights movement. It was women who stuffed the envelopes and made the food and did all the things. In white nationalist movements, it's the women who sew all the robes and make the casseroles and stuff all the envelopes. And so white women, and I often just to give myself a story, I have to inhabit the plantation owner's wife. White women have often been positioned in this way, and you have a choice. You're going to stand with your man on that porch, or are you going to take sides with your maid? And we know where our bread is buttered on. So we have to get rid of this sort of naivete and this mythology of white woman innocence, because white women have been weaponized against people of color from the very beginning. And right now you can see a more current iteration of that with the weaponization of, as they say, white women's tears, with barbecue Becky and poolside Becky, right? And like white women calling the police, right, on people of color. Like that, this is part of our legacy as white women. And so that's the first thing. Step one, admit you have a problem. And then beyond that, in some ways, this is, I think, one of the powers of intersectionality for me, is that one of the things about intersectionality is it creates points of empathy and points of connection. I'm not saying that, oh, I understand what it's like to be a woman, therefore I understand what it's like to be black. That's not what I mean. I just mean points of empathy. And so I came into women's studies, and that was easy for me. I took my first women's studies class. I was like, this is bullshit. I'm so mad. I knew it was a thing. But you had to drag me to anti-racism and to grappling with my white privilege. And so for me, being an anti-racist feminist has been an essential part of my practice. And of course, it's more difficult for me. As we say in the social sciences, privilege is blinding. And again, if you want to get woke, if you want to take these medicines that open the third eye, it's going to be our privilege that blinds us. So I would give my same advice that I gave to white brothers to myself as a white woman. And so I have to take these lessons in order to learn to grapple with my whiteness. And I just want to share like one example, because you already covered the structural work. But since I already did structure, I'll bring it back down to the personal, which is, I think that for those of us who fancy ourselves as allies, who think of ourselves as liberal and progressives, right, who know that we've already done our anti-racism, right, because we're in Berkeley, right? We're in a progressive location. I think for that actually creates additional blinders for us because we think we've already done our work and that we're already woke, and it's painful as hell when you fuck it up again. And so as one example, I went recently to a critical ethnic studies conference as a white woman studying race, and I understood the complexity of being there, and I told myself, white girl, that's another important thing, know that you're white, name it, right? I was like, white girl, shut the fuck up. It's not your space. Shut the fuck up. It's not your space. And I went to a panel and I got a little excited. I was like, ooh. Hermione was like, ooh. And I asked the question and inserted myself in this space, and this very conscious, like super radical graduate student called me the fuck out in public, harshly. Breathing in, this is... Woo, breathing in, this is white fragility. Breathing out, this is white fragility. Breathing in, this is white fragility. And I teach this to my undergraduate students, and we can get so holier than thou, woker than thou about that shit, like, oh, in your little white fragility. No, for real though. For real though. And so I use the tools of this practice, right? When you are triggered, what do? You breathe. And you come back to your breath, and you watch it roll through you, and you find the lesson. So that's one lesson. I think that these tools can help us do that difficult political work when we have to dig out, as Audre Lorde would say, that piece of the oppressor deep within you. And then lastly, because I'm over quota, this has to be a collective process. So when you're in your white fragility, I would recommend the book by Robin DiAngelo, White Fragility. When you're doing that work, it also has to be a collective process. Do not bring that work to people of color. Do not ask people of color to support you. Do not go up to them to get your white person certificate re-signed. If we're going to do that, we need to start giving people of color a stipend for helping us with our emotional labor. Go to your white allies. Go to your white friends. I went to my white girlfriend. I was like, oh. She's like, girl, I know it's so hard. So white people need to support each other so that we can dig out the white supremacy in our cultures and in ourselves that we are responsible for. And so that would be my answer to this question about working with whiteness through our work here.
There isn't much more else to say. But what I would like to add is just along the ideas of creating subcultures and answering the question of what white folks can do, which is, again, creating subcultures, because I think that white folks have such good intentions of wanting to do the work and not be harmful when sometimes they don't understand their own triggers and their own places where they can harm people of color. And so I think it's really important to have a critical awareness of blind spots, and those blind spots need to be talked about with white people in that context. And so really creating subgroups to talk about those issues, I think, is a very important place to begin. And I think that's something that's not talked about enough, because I think that we try to move towards the collective work, but we haven't done the individual work first. And so I think it's important to do both at the same time. Yes. Just trying to think if there is something else I want to say. Related to, again, what white folks can do, which you graciously touched on it just a second ago, which is this concept of white fragility. And I think that white folks are like, oh, what can we do to help? And I think that, again, the intent is good, but I think that kind of puts people of color in the position. If a white person is asking a person of color, what can we do to help? You're putting that burden, that labor on the person of color. And that's not our place to do, because we've been doing the work for a very long time, not only individually as a people of color group, but also with white people too, and we're tired. So again, going back to the subgroups, really finding your tribe of white folks to deconstruct white supremacy and the habits and biases that you've picked up along the way, I think is a really good place to start.
Just to put a fine, I like the idea of the stipends. You know, doing the work. I might incorporate that here. Somebody asked about the practical or the practices that are essential for the power to work. I mean, I'm assuming it meant the power of the plant medicine to work. And I guess for me, what I spoke to was the essential component of respect and honoring of the medicine, which in ayahuasca circles and ceremonies, there's a lot of that goes on by the usually people who are leading the circle, the healers. But I mean, on an individual level, each person who imbibes or partakes to really honor the essence of the plants, you know, everything. Even I think of tobacco, because tobacco is sacred. Tobacco is a sacred plant, but you would never know it, right? And look at all the negative consequences of that. And I think a lot of that comes out of not honoring what is sacred within the plants, right? What can heal can also kill in the plant world. So just to be cognizant of that.
Does anybody else want to say anything?
Somebody asked about creating community. And I just think creating community that's a huge issue that we could talk about for a long time. But I just wanted to acknowledge the question. I think it's a really important one. I don't think you need to be in a major urban area to start creating community around these things. Sometimes maybe it's helpful to invite somebody to come give a talk and just see who shows up, and then invite people who are in the room to meet again sometime, and that might start a process of having a conversation.
Well, thank you so much, panelists. We're going to have Bia make a quick announcement.
Yeah, just want to say a few 2 cents of mine. Clarify that I was having my own presentation, and we called our friends from MAPS to talk about ethical issues, and the program got pretty cramped. I just wanted to say that recently in Brazil, I was called to help some friends that had suffered sexual abuse in ayahuasca communities. So one is the case of this famous guru that is like a famous celebrity that became really acknowledged, and he's the guy of the main TV show and all the celebrities, and it revealed that he had like affairs with 2 of his followers for 2 years without their husbands, who were like his best friends, knowing. And then he just came out with a series of videos saying that the dark energies of our times were trying to block, the light from Earth, and all those kinds of things that were truly revolting. And the other one was also having some affairs, and some women did engage in those affairs, and we created this hashtag, Abuse Not Consent. And this forum is a little bit an attempt to deal with all these questions. And we also are launching this manual on preventing sexual abuse, and I just want to acknowledge at the same time that we do want to advance these conversations. These are complex issues, not to make rape or abuse relative, but there are so many dimensions, and how can we do this in a really effective way that is like efficient for public policy and for the regular person and keep at the same time the complexity alive. And I think that's where the challenge between being an intellectual and academic and being an activist is really particularly strong. I want to give an example that we showed our manual to this important Brazilian indigenous leadership, where we had originally talked about, we're trying to think of all this American or Western women from the global north going to the Amazon and drinking ayahuasca and frequently doing things like going naked in the river and wearing small skirts or things like that. And so we're trying to navigate the tensions between, North American, global north rhetoric and, ideas such as don't tell me what to wear, versus, which I appreciate that Michelle brought up as an example, versus the fact that this does deliver a confusing message sometimes for some Native men in communities. And I was having this conversation with this indigenous woman who was saying, these women don't have a clue. They're coming here and they're being highly disrespectful to what we do over here. And how are you going to put in the head of the índio aldeado, like the, I don't know if I'm going to say wrong words in English, forgive me, indigenous person that lives in a village, that she's just like loving nature and exchanging with the spirits, and that's not a provocation. So I think, there's a challenge as we move forward to always contemplate that these things can be complex and can have a kind of weird gray area. And I hope that we can keep this debate, taking into account all of these dimensions. So I just wanted to say this one piece of our manual, because we did struggle trying, as we wrote it, to be fair to all discourses and to all the people that could read it. And I think we've been going through a very large day, and there was no break at all. So I'm going to end a little bit closer, unless somebody feels they have something very compelling to say.
It's about respect. You're a guest in someone's home. I'm done.
I just want to say that, also acknowledge Annette when I invited her to come. She said, no, I don't have anything to say. I don't study those subjects. And I'm so pleased, and this is also the beauty of this space, because she is from Jamaica, back originally American, and she made me feel in Brazil more than anybody else in this panel. So that's really wonderful about how we exchange, and I mentioned Oshun, how we are creating these hybrid communities and how we're creating networks and bonds between all of us that in many ways do go beyond gender and race and class and have to do with our connection as humans. I also want to thank Wendy for reminding me that I guess I was feeling too guilty that we were not including enough of the topic of the drug war in this day, but it's not that I wanted actively to exclude this topic, of course. It's just perhaps that, it's complicated to just go talk about psychedelics when there's something very big happening, which is the drug war and the non-psychedelic drugs and the effects on, both incarceration and public health issues and all of that. And I want to also just remind people that we have a few projects in Chacruna going on. One is the Council of for the Protection of Sacred Plants, and the other one is the Ayahuasca Community. And I'm also going again to just throw my 2 cents to us to talk about, remember, the problem of peyote conservation in the US, which is huge. So I'm heading 3 of these projects, looking for funding and support. If anybody feels compelled to talk more about this, please look me up. And thank you so much for your incredible sharing and putting your heart and being, willing to open your personal stories. Thank you for speaking for free, for not being paid, for donating your time. And they flew all the way from the East Coast on their own expenses. And we appreciate also, again, I just want to name Vicky Delay and Compassion for Addiction and Rick Doblin and MAPS and NEOC and HM and the Women's Visionary Council and all the people that are making this event possible. We're going to have a break. We have a few tables that you can visit around. We encourage you to go pick up materials, sign up for newsletters, exchange telephones. Some of us are going to stay inside here who brought sandwiches. If others want to just sneak outside, come back. The place is going to be open. It's going to be informal gathering. And we regather at 7 here. Thank you very much. Thank you, everybody that is watching the streaming, especially our friends in MAPS Canada, Catherine, and all of them. Meet you at 7 again.